Alex, congratulations.
Thank you.
How does it feel to be standing here, having just defeated the defending champion on centre court?
Center court has a way of going quiet at exactly the wrong moment for whoever is losing. It happened on the evening of Monday, July 6, 2026, and the person standing in that silence was a 21-year-old from the Philippines who, 48 hours earlier, had just done something nobody from her country had ever done on a tennis court. Eala had beaten the defending Wimbledon champion. Now she was trying to survive a deciding set against a two-time Grand Slam finalist, and the same shot that carried her through the tournament's biggest upset was quietly falling apart in her hands. She would lose that match 6-4, 4-6, 6-3 to Jasmine Paolini of Italy. And the story of why is far more specific and far more fixable than a simple case of nerves. To understand how big this moment was, you have to understand what Eala walked into center court carrying. 2 days earlier, on July 4th, she had produced one of the biggest upsets of the entire tournament, defeating reigning champion and world number 3 Iga Swiatek in a match that stretched a first-set tiebreak before Eala closed it out in straight sets. It instantly became the signature win of her career, and it made her the first Filipino player, man or woman, to reach the second week of a Grand Slam in the Open era. The moment traveled fast. Praise poured in from figures across the sport, and back home in the Philippines, a free public watch party was organized at the PhilSports Arena in Pasig City for her next match, with room for thousands of fans to gather and watch together on a big screen. That next match was a round of 16 against Jasmine Paolini, a 30-year-old former world number 4 who reached the Wimbledon final in 2024 and had been dealing with an up-and-down season heading into the tournament. The two had actually met once before, back in February at the Dubai Tennis Championships, where Eala won in straight sets. So this was not a matchup where Eala had reason to feel overmatched. If anything, recent history and the momentum of the Swiatek, when pointed toward her favor, the odds makers agreed. Going into the match, Eala was priced as the market favorite, largely on the strength of her serve numbers throughout the tournament, where she had been landing a healthy share of second serves and winning points comfortably behind them. That detail matters enormously because it sets up the central irony of everything that followed. The serve that was supposed to be one of her better weapons heading into this specific match became the exact thing that fell apart when the lights were brightest. The contest opened with both players holding serve for the first 3 games, a fairly even start that gave no hint of what was coming. Then, in the 4th game, Paolini found her opening. She broke Eala's serve by targeting the second delivery, and she followed the break with a comfortable hold of her own to surge ahead 4-1. For a moment, it looked like it might turn into a rout. But Eala, showing the competitive streak that had carried her through the tournament, dug in. She held to trim the deficit, earned a break point of her own, and briefly threatened to swing the set back in her direction. Paolini answered immediately, breaking straight back to level things at 2-2, and the two traded holds until Eala broke again to push ahead 4-3. It looked, for a moment, like Eala might close out the opener. Instead, Paolini broke back one final time and served out the first set 6-4 in just under an hour. The second set told a very different story, and it is the part of the match that should have been the springboard to victory. Eala came out swinging, wasted a few early break chances, then found her rhythm. The single most dramatic moment of the entire match happened here. Serving at 3-3, Eala fell behind love, 40 on her own racket, 3 break points against her, the kind of position that ends careers of momentum in a hurry. Instead, she reeled off 5 consecutive points to hold for 5-3, a hold so emphatic that center court rose in appreciation. She closed out the set from there, forcing the match into a decider. And this is where the match turned on details so small they're almost impossible to see live, but which decided everything. With the third set locked at 3-3, Eala held 2 break points on Paolini's serve and could not convert either. Then, serving to stay level at 3-4, she reached 40-30, 2 points from holding and keeping herself very much alive in the match. From there, the errors came in a cluster. A backhand pushed long to bring to deuce, a forehand dragged wide to hand Paolini advantage, a double fault at the worst possible instant, and one more long backhand to finish it off. 4 unforced errors in a row, at the exact moment she needed for clean points, handed Paolini the break and, soon after, the match. Across the whole afternoon, Eala converted only 3 of her 10 breakpoint opportunities. In a contest this tight, that single category of wasted chances is close to the entire difference between the two players. Here is where the story stops being about vibes and nerves and becomes a matter of hard numbers, because the official match statistics from the WTA tell a very specific story. Eala landed only 55.7% of her first serves in the match. When her second serve was in play, she won just 48.7% of those points, a number that means she was losing the coin flip on nearly every one of her own service games that reached a second delivery. Paolini, by contrast, served with far more control and pressed the advantage every time Eala's second serve floated in short and slow. None of this was a total surprise to people who follow the tour closely. Eala's service speed has been a known conversation point in tennis circles for well over a year, and it came up repeatedly during Wimbledon fortnight. Speaking on Tennis Channel after the loss, Martina Navratilova did not soften her assessment, describing the delivery as sight index equals 14-1, too much of a puffball/sight, and pointing out that Eala is physically capable of hitting a serve well over 100 miles per hour but rarely does. It is a blunt assessment from one of the most decorated players in the sport's history, and it lines up precisely with what happened on the scoreboard. What makes the picture even more interesting is that the same serve had worked beautifully just 2 days earlier. Iga Swiatek, after a loss to Eala in the third round, admitted in her press conference that returning a slower, well-placed serve was genuinely more difficult for her than dealing with pace, saying sight index equals 13-1. It was tougher mentally for her to accept the missed returns coming off the slower deliveries/sight. Against Swiatek, the tactic worked exactly as designed. Against Paolini, a player with a completely different return game and far more experience reading spin and placement rather than raw speed, the same serve turned into a liability. It is a reminder that a weapon is never good or bad in isolation. It is good or bad against a specific opponent on a specific day, and Paolini was precisely the kind of returner built to punish it. Numbers alone do not explain everything, and Eala herself pointed to something more human in the aftermath. Beating the defending champion is not something a player simply files away and moves past by the following afternoon. It is the biggest result of a career, delivered on the largest stage in the sport, and coming down from that high while still needing to compete at the same intensity 48 hours later is one of the least talked about challenges in professional tennis. Eala has referenced this pattern in her own career before, noting that this was not the first time she produced a major win, and then had to turn around and play again almost immediately, and that learning to manage the emotional come-down is simply part of being a professional. It would be easy to overstate this factor, but it would be a mistake to ignore entirely. A player who has just authored the biggest upset of her career is not walking onto the court in the same physical or mental state she was in during her third-round match, even if her technique has not changed overnight. Add to that the taping visible on her forearm during the match, which she described as a preventive measure related to a long season rather than a specific injury, and you get the picture of an athlete who was managing both fatigue and adrenaline at the same time, on the sport's most demanding court, against an opponent who had absolutely nothing to lose. Any honest account of this match has to give real credit to Jasmine Paolini, because her side of the story is just as important as Eala's. Paolini arrived at Wimbledon 2026 with a season record that had not been kind to her, without a second-week Grand Slam appearance since the previous year's French Open, and dealing with fitness issues that had disrupted her grass court preparation. She even dropped her very first set of the tournament by a lopsided 6-0 scoreline. None of that suggested a player heading toward a deep run, and yet by the time she walked onto center court to face Eala, she was played with the calm of someone who has already been through every version of pressure tennis can offer. She is a former world number 4, and reached the finals of both the French Open and Wimbledon in 2024. And that kind of experience does not disappear just because a season goes sideways. That composure showed up exactly when it mattered most. In the decisive stretches of the match, Paolini simply did not blink. She converted her breakpoint chance when it counted, saved the pressure points on her own serve, and closed out the match with the calm efficiency of someone who has done this before. She was even candid afterward about the extra motivation of playing in front of Roger Federer, who was seated in the royal box, admitting that part of her focus during the match was simply trying not to think too much about her idol watching from a few rows away. It is a small human detail that captures something true about the day. Two players managing very different kind of pressure, and the more experienced one handling hers just a little better when it counted. Beyond the raw percentages, there was a more specific tactical wrinkle that caught the attention of commentators watching closely, and it centers on something unique to Eala's game. She is a left-hander, a trait that gives naturally gifted advantages on serve that right-handed players simply do not have access to. A graphic shown during the match's second set revealed that Eala was serving out wide only about a third of the time on the advantage side, and down the middle only slightly more often than that on the deuce side, essentially the reverse of the pattern that tends to maximize a lefty's natural angles. Watching from a BBC commentary booth, Martina Navratilova was openly puzzled by the decision, saying flatly, sight index equals 12-1. For a lefty, this is crazy/sight, and noting that Eala was not using her natural slice to pull right-handed opponents off the court nearly as often as the geometry of her own game would suggest. It is worth noting that not every expert agreed this was the obvious fix it might sound like. Former British number one Laura Robson pushed back on the idea in commentary, making the point that a wide serve without enough pace behind it can simply sit up and invite an aggressive return, particularly against a player like Paolini, who is comfortable stepping in and taking the ball early. In other words, serving wide only helps if there's enough behind it to make the placement dangerous rather than just different. That disagreement between two respected voices tells you something important. This was not a case of an obvious, lazy mistake sitting there for anyone to spot. It was a genuine strategic trade-off, and reasonable tennis minds landed in different places on how to solve it. What both experts agreed on, though, is the underlying diagnosis. The serve itself needs more pace and more variety to become a genuine weapon at the top of the game, rather than a shot opponents can simply wait out. Navratilova was direct about the path forward, suggesting that given Eala's height, her serve has real room to become one of the best tools in her arsenal rather than one of its more exploitable parts. The commentary around this match extended well beyond the serve conversation, and it is worth pulling together because it paints a fuller picture of how the tennis world processed this result. Former world number one Caroline Wozniacki framed the loss through the lens of inexperience rather than any single technical flaw, describing it as part of the ordinary growing process a young player goes through while learning to manage her nerves in the biggest moments the sport can offer, while making clear she still expects big things ahead. Reports out of the Philippines echoed a version of this, noting that Eala's backhand became increasingly error-prone as the occasion grew heavier in the deciding set, a pattern consistent with a player who was managing pressure as much as she was managing tactics. Former British number one Greg Ruzetsky, speaking on a tennis podcast in the days after the match, offered a similarly forward-looking read, arguing that Eala already understands how to mix up her serve, but simply needs to sharpen the accuracy and power behind it, something he expects will come with more time on tour. He went further, comparing her competitive makeup to that of Rafael Nadal, whose academy in Spain Eala has trained at, and predicting that this will not be the last time she reaches the second week of a major. Put all of these voices together, and a consistent picture emerges. Nobody who watched this match closely walked away thinking Eala had been exposed as fundamentally overmatched at this level. The consensus, across several respected voices in the sport, was that a specific, identifiable, and correctable part of her game had let her down on a day when everything else about her tennis was good enough to win. It is easy, in the immediate aftermath of a loss like this, to focus entirely on what went wrong. But the full picture of Eala's Wimbledon requires looking at what she gained, because by any reasonable measure, this was still the best fortnight of her career. Reaching the fourth round earned her 240 ranking points, pushing her career total to 1,666 and lifting her to a projected career-high world ranking of number 28. She became the first Filipino player in the Open era, male or female, to reach the second week of a Grand Slam tournament, a milestone that stood on its own regardless of how the Paolini match ended. And this result did not come out of nowhere. It capped off a strong grass court swing that included a title run at the Birmingham Open and a semifinal appearance in Berlin, meaning the Wimbledon run was the peak of a genuine hot streak rather than a one-off fluke built entirely on a single upset. The way Eala handled the loss publicly also deserves mention, because it reflects the same competitive maturity that carried her through the tournament in the first place. In her press conference afterward, She spoke about the margins being extremely fine at this level, acknowledging that the difference between advancing and going home often comes down to a handful of specific moments rather than a broad gap in ability. That is a notably clear-eyed read on a match that had just ended her tournament, and it suggests a player who is already thinking about the technical adjustments ahead rather than dwelling on the result itself. There's a case to be made, and it is not a hollow one, that this specific defeat will end up serving Eala better in the long run than an early, comfortable win might have. The problems exposed in this match are not mysteries. They are not questions about whether she belongs on the stage, because beating a defending Wimbledon champion already answered that question in the loudest way possible. Instead, this match handed her and her coaching team a precise diagnostic. The serve percentage numbers are specific and trackable. The tactical conversation around her lefty placement is specific and coachable. The pattern of tightening up at the exact moment a set is on the line is something that tends to improve simply through repeated exposure to exactly this kind of pressure, which is precisely what she just gained an enormous amount of in a very short window. Compare this to a version of the tournament where Eala loses quietly in an earlier round to a player ranked well above her. That kind of defeat teaches far less, because it does not clarify what specifically needs to change. This loss did the opposite. It happened on the largest stage possible, against an opponent skilled and experienced enough to expose the exact weak point in her game, in a match close enough that the difference came down to single points rather than a gap in class. That is about as useful a data point as a 21-year-old could ask for heading into the second half